Hello and welcome to Money Trail with me, Amir Arafat. Today, more bad news for the US-led Western economy. From the sixth consecutive month of double-dip recession in Europe to sequestration inside the United States, biting everything and everyone, from Pentagon civilian employees to Medicare and Medicaid. That is, the Fed keeps pumping $85 billion a month unabated into the economy. A string of negative economic figures was released this past week, pointing to continuing stagnation in the U.S. in the midst of a worsening slump internationally. According to the U.S. Labor Department, new claims for unemployment benefits have jumped by the highest amount in 6 months. Retail giant Walmart says its sales tumbled unexpectedly in the first quarter of the year. Internationally, for the fourth consecutive year, the United States fell in the global competitive rankings, largely because of worsening criticism of the U.S. government, and is now in 7th place. U.S. manufacturing slowed for a second straight month in May, as weak overseas demand and government belt-tightening at home led to the sector's most sluggish rate of growth since October. According to the latest Pew poll, 50% of Americans now think that the economy is not only in decline, rather, it's getting worse. Americans have been more likely to say the economy is getting worse than getting better in each weekly average since Gallup began daily tracking back in 2008.
Unfortunately, the average person is unaware of what's really important in addition to the items they see so easily. For example, many Americans don't know why a $16 trillion deficit has any meaning for them. They don't know how it hurts them or helps them or anything else. They don't understand that the Federal Reserve has been playing games for years to buy time for America, to hide the fact that the American government could not possibly pay for this amount of deficit borrowings with normal interest rates, which is why they had to force it down to nearly zero interest rates, in order to enable us to continue our endless wars and to enable us to have entitlement programs such as Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid that are structurally very flawed. They don't see any of this. They don't understand the long-term consequences to America alone and the negative impact it's having around the world.
The U.S. economy is visibly losing momentum, and there is small consolation of the fact that Europe is in worse shape, enduring the longest recession since the Eurozone was formed 13 years ago. U.S. growth has averaged just 2.2% since the recession officially ended 4 years ago, but that is nothing to write home about since it is barely half the 4.2% average of the 7 previous recoveries, and the prospects are disheartening. The number of people in the U.S. who filed new claims for unemployment benefits grew by 32,000, hitting 360,000 in the week ending May 11th, significantly higher than economists had predicted. According to the Federal Reserve, U.S. industrial production fell last month, registering its sharpest decline in 8 months. American factories, mines, and utilities reduced their output by 0.5% in April, compared to a predicted drop of 0.2%. Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia says its economic index for the Mid-Atlantic region fell dramatically in May to minus 5.2 from plus 1.3 in April, indicating an economic contraction. Walmart says its sales at its U.S. stores fell by 1.4% in the first quarter, and visits to its store fell by 1.8%. The drop in sales by the retailer, which sells primarily to working-class people, reflects the impact of falling wages and continuing mass unemployment. The negative figures have prompted commentators to predict a slowdown in U.S. growth in the second quarter of the year, comparable to the last 3 months of 2012, when the economy slowed to a crawl.
The real state of the physical economy in the United States is horrible, and it's been on a steady decline for decades, and it's only accelerated under the Obama presidency. The statistics on employment totally are masked by the fact that you've had the largest percentage of people since the keeping of the records who've been removed from the labor force because they've gotten so demoralized that they've either stopped looking for a job, or in the case of many young people, they got out of high school, or they even in many cases got out of college and have been unable to find a job. So the 7.8 or 7.5% figure of unemployment is a gross understatement. And the real level of unemployment in the United States is minimally in the range of 20%. When you look at the age bracket of people in their 20s up to 35 years old, the figure is well over 25%. And 19 million people have left the labor force, even though they are of working age, since 2009, when President Obama came into office.
The U.S. economy added 138,000 jobs in March and 165,000 in April, barely enough to keep up with population growth. Despite pockets of strength, the economy as a whole cannot gain a real momentum and enjoy what is called escape velocity. The millions of Americans who are unemployed or underemployed are pessimistic and even frightened about their future. Those who have jobs worry about losing them. Fewer Americans are at work today than in April 2000, even though the population has grown by nearly 30 million people since then. Millions of homes have been foreclosed. The Pew Research Center has reported that a share of Americans calling themselves middle class has declined over the last 4 years from 53% to under 49%, with 50% now saying the economy is simply getting worse. The response of GDP growth to policy stimulus is about half what it usually is, even though the fiscal and monetary stimulus has been the greatest in 75 years. Another factor contributing to the unemployment crisis in the U.S., education or lack thereof. The government now saying, well, there are certain positions available, but not enough skills to match them. That as student debt soars well above $1 trillion, with students defaulting on around $100 billion. Not to mention the tuition fees, well through the roof, making college education unaffordable for many students.
I've been a professor now for more than 30 years, and the test scores on examinations have gone down steadily during that period. We have students who don't care. We have universities who simply want to maximize the number of people they graduate. We don't have people ambitious to master learning or trades or anything else. And this is what's behind our failure in building new factories. Is we are desperately trying to bring in workers from overseas. If you see testimony before Congress frequently, the major corporations are lobbying for what they call H-1B visas, which means visas for highly technical trained people. The heads of American corporations know that they're not going to turn around in the short time, if ever, the ambitions and desires of people currently here, unfortunately, and that they have to bring in people from around the world to work here who have the right work ethic.
Well, QE1, QE2, and now QE3, that is quantitative easing, the Federal Reserve's buzzword for printing money, or rather printing debt. $17 trillion of federal debt already and adding, well, $85 billion a month, unabated, endlessly. That's pretty much the story right now as we speak. So Ben Bernanke, in fact, they keep pumping all they can into the economy. So if you think the economy is not really that good, imagine what it would be like without $85 billion of debt-based money poured into the economy. But no one actually knows the actual amount of money being pumped. We're hearing things like $85 billion a month. But just a few years back, as all eyes were in U.S. Congress, speaking about around $1 trillion out of the taxpayers' pockets, Bloomberg, after just a few years, figured that it was $7.7 trillion gone out of the taxpayers' pockets.
The level of deception would embarrass magicians. In fact, there have even been some claims that some of this quantitative easing funds have gone over to European organizations on top of that. That's not something that the mainstream American media would want the average American to know about. So a lot of things are done in the dark with the idea of deceiving people as to what they're really doing and how bad the situation really is.
It's not a stimulus program at all because the banks are receiving $85 billion a month. Really, it's not the banks. It's about 8 of the banks that have been designated as too big to fail. They were bailed out after 2008, and the exact figure that was provided by Neil Barofsky, who was the Inspector General of the TARP program. In the summer of 2011, he testified before the U.S. Congress, and he said that between the Treasury Department and the Fed, the total cost to American taxpayers of the bailout had been well in excess of $15 trillion, and that in fact there were still various programs to further bail out these too big to fail banks, and the sum total of the bailout up until that point was $23.7 trillion.
After $85 billion of quantitative easing in QE3, we haven't seen the effects for the simple reason that quantitative easing is pushing money into the financial speculative economy. And that doesn't make its way to the small to medium-sized enterprise, the job-creating sector. So more quantitative easing, when we have QE4, QE5, QE6 in the trillions, whatever it is still not going to get to where the economy needs it to get.
Well, interestingly enough, the claim made by Bernanke about his quantitative easing programs was that there would be a consumption wealth effect. Some of the critics jokingly call that a wealth trickle-down effect. His claim was that if we inflate the prices of stocks on the stock exchanges, that the people who see their stocks go up will then spend some of that money on goods and services. That's a joke.
Led by the U.S. Federal Reserve, central banks throughout the world have sought to stave off the effects of the global slump through massive infusions of cash into the world financial system. This has served to inflate stock values and corporate profits, even as the ruling class intensified its assault on jobs, wages, and social services, driving the world economy deeper into slump. There are indications, however, that the effectiveness of these vast, unprecedented money-printing operations in staving off deflation is reaching its limit.
Well, what we're seeing from all of the central banks and the banking system in general is policies directed at kicking the can down the road a little bit further and propping up the unsustainable a little bit more. And when the entire system gets a little bit too unsustainable, they tend to use fraud in order to prop up the system. And so what you see right now is central banks propping up other central banks in order to prop up banking systems, and really all done under unsustainable, in an unsustainable way, just simply kicking the can down the road a little bit further. And it's reached the point right now where it's very, very difficult and tricky to actually understand the flows across these large banking institutions. And it's all directed at propping up the unsustainable and getting back to business as usual, as the banks know it.
This whole quantitative easing has been a very stupid idea. There are some people who excuse the very first rounds of it, saying, oh, the markets were so stressed they needed some liquidity. But the later rounds of quantitative easing, it's hard to find honest supporters of it. It creates bubbles, then the bubbles have to be deflated. People have been hurt. It's hard for any companies or individuals to make any plans for the future. It's hard to make rational decisions. Savers have been badly hurt. I mean, in the past, people who are at or near retirement age would depend very heavily on safe securities of deposit, federally insured, and depend on that for income. Well, when that drops down to nearly 0% interest return, they can't do that. And the basic response of Bernanke and the Fed is, well, that's too bad. They can just go in the stock market. Well, the stock market is very risky. And lots of professional investors, including some of the most famous hedge fund managers, lost money last year in the markets. But this has been the consequences at the American level for this. There have been international consequences too. The continuing trashing of the American dollar by the American government has led many foreign countries, especially those such as OPEC countries that sell oil and other commodities, to understand that they're being robbed by American thieves with this money that's really like an ice cube that melts away as soon as they get it in their hands. And so many countries have now turned to bartering or to requiring payments in baskets of currencies.
But who's watching the U.S. Federal Reserve? Is it the U.S. Congress, the elected officials, representatives of the American people, or the White House? Turns out, none of the above. Well, the only thing federal about the Federal Reserve happens to be a name, agreed upon by a group of private bankers about a century ago in a place called the Jekyll Island.
Well, the central banking system was originally founded, its foundations were in the UK with the Bank of England in 1694. That was originally a private bank, which over the years has steadily, one bit at a time, been nationalized, and very recently. But the Federal Reserve, the US central bank, was based upon the UK central bank, the Bank of England. Now, the US Federal Reserve is 100% a private institution. It's not federal at all.
Former Congressman Ron Paul and Republican presidential candidate attempted for many years to have audits done of the Fed. And for a long time he was opposed. Gradually over time he started getting some support within Congress, but there has been considerable resistance on one side and lack of interest because the average American has no concept of what the Fed is and why it should be audited. And so, as you've noted, these bankers have been able to pursue their interests in the dark without anyone knowing really how bad it is and what they're really doing.
It's unbelievable the lack of accountability that the Federal Reserve has, given the importance it has on not only the US economy, but the entire world. And the accountability and the audit trail is not transparent at all. And the central banking system alongside the banking system are two of the least transparent systems that are completely unaccountable out there.
They call it sequestration, another Washington buzzword meaning some $1.2 trillion of automatic cuts in government spending. That after President Obama's super committee failed to find ways to balance the budget or deficit or the total debt over the course of the next 10 years to the tune of some $4 trillion. But sequestration is $1.2 trillion taken off government spending over the next 10 years, when many economists say, well, we're all Keynesians now and the U.S. economy needs government spending. Turns out this sequestration is now biting everything and everyone across the board, from the Pentagon's civilian employees, hundreds of thousands of whom are now put on forced unpaid furloughs, all the way down to Medicare and Medicaid, biting some $500 billion out of Social Security over the next 10 years. A drop in government spending dragged more on the U.S. economy than initially thought in the first 3 months of the year, a sign of increasing pain from Washington's austerity drive. The U.S. Defense Department has announced that it would begin unpaid furloughs for hundreds of thousands of its civilian employees as part of the imposition of $85 billion in sequester budget cuts this fiscal year. And the Obama administration is preparing a sweeping attack on Social Security and Medicare, proposing to cut a combined total of more than $500 billion from the two programs over 10 years and implement structural changes that will slash benefits for millions of retirees. There are more than 2 million unemployed Americans who might have had jobs if not for austerity. That's the conclusion of a new study by Michael Greenstone and Adam Looney at the Brookings Institution. In the 46 months since the Great Recession officially ended, state, local, and federal governments have cut about 500,000 jobs. In contrast, every other U.S. recession since 1970, the government hired approximately 1.7 million people on average. That means the U.S. is an estimated 2.2 million jobs in the hole.
The sequestration is really the cherry on top of the sundae. It's caused, as you indicated, 2.2 or so million immediate job losses. Many federal employees are losing 20% of their salaries under this furlough program, and major social safety net programs like Medicaid are being completely gutted through the combination of Obamacare on the one hand and sequestration on the other. These policies are so destructive that the only real way to measure the impact of these policies is by looking at the increase in the death rate among the American people. Because as we look back from a year or two from now, that's going to be the major consequence of these policies. People who are relying on pre-existing medical programs to basically stay alive are finding that those programs have been shut down or drastically reduced, and they can't get the kind of medical care that'll keep them alive.
With quantitative easing on the one hand and sequestration on the other, and all the negative news in between, where is all this headed?
We're headed for a major social crisis, largely caused by the failure of economic policy.
America is a country where 23 million households, or some 48 million people, now need food stamps, representing almost 15% of the population and 30% of adults. Add to that some 11 million Americans who live on disability benefits. It is hardly surprising that there is so little incentive to invest in new plants and equipment. Capital spending remains one of the most critical missing links in the tepid recovery of the U.S. The consumer can't seem to pull the economy out of the doldrums anymore. The public is weary of trying to cope with personal and family debt. Personal savings have been gobbled up, and the savings rate is down from 4.7% to 2.6% in the first quarter of this year.
Potentially, it leads to mass social unrest and social chaos because the wealth gap has risen so rapidly that the upper 1% income bracket earns more than the lower 50%. And that's an untenable situation. That's a situation that leads towards a social revolution.
Well, thank you for watching. Always follow the money trail with me, Amir Arfa.